Hi, Mom, Mary, Cary, and any other family or friends who may be watching this. We made this tape in January of 1994. David and the boys and I had gone down to LA to visit Mom and Dad and to see Disneyland. We almost canceled our trip because that was the day of the Los Angeles earthquake. But after being assured that there was no damage in Pasadena and that Burbank Airport had remained open, we decided to go. Very fortunately we did, because not only was the weather beautiful, Disneyland very uncrowded, but it turned out to be our last visit with Dad. David had suggested that we get Dad to talk about his life and to tell some of his stories on video. Little did we imagine that barely 2 months after this, he would be gone. We didn't edit or cut this tape in any way, and it's rather unprofessional. There are several interruptions from the kids, but we decided to just put it together in its entirety, and knowing that it would be very dear to all of us who knew and loved Cary Nelson Weisiger III.
We just wanted to hear a little bit of the story of your life and Mimi's life, and maybe if you could talk about where you were born and some of your early recollections, where you lived, what your parents did, that sort of thing.
Okay. Now, am I to hold the microphone?
No, you
it's-
don't.
it's
This
on the
films.
camera.
You just
Oh, it is.
you
Yeah.
just talk and
This is just a remote in case we want to.
We're live now.
You're live.
yeah.
Well, I was.
Introduce yourself first.
I'm Cary N. Weisiger III. I have the same name that my father and grandfather had. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, January 11, 1910. So my earliest recollections are of St. Louis. I'm not.
It doesn't matter. This is no big
Very
deal.
informal and
It can be erased and edited, and
yeah, you don't even need
no
to
big
look
deal.
at the camera. I mean, it's,
I have a memory of our country being at war in the First World War.
mhm.
And I was supposed to knit a wash rag in a class, but my knitting was very spotty and I wasn't successful. But I do remember hearing newsboys shouting out on November 11, 1918, about an armistice. And so for a long time, that day was observed by our country as Armistice Day. And later, Congress, in its great wisdom, changed the name of it to Veterans Day.
So you would have been what age around at that time?
I was 8 years old then, when the war ended. I recall looking in the newspaper at the spiked helmet that the Kaiser wore, and I thought of him as almost Satan, the way he was represented, and the Germans were described as Huns. We lived on Berlin Avenue in St. Louis, but during that war, the anti-German feeling was so great that the name of it was changed to Pershing.
huh.
And after the general of the Allied forces, John J. Pershing. My memory is of going to a grade school on Taylor and Olive Streets in St. Louis. It was a mixed school. I do recall that we had some blacks in the school. And somewhere in those early grades, I was pushed ahead so that when we moved to Evanston, Illinois, I graduated from the 8th grade at 12 years of age. I don't recommend pushing children like that because I hadn't grown up to that age along with many in my class.
Your physical growth?
Yes,
was...
my physical growth was slow. And one of my most vivid memories was of being permitted by my mother to go down to the beach at Main Street, Evanston, for a day in June when we were to have graduation from the elementary school. And so I and two friends went down there with our lunches, and we were playing Northwest Royal Mounted Police in the small dunes on the beach. And in the afternoon we went out into the water, and swimming there was not done at the Main Street Pier, which was an old rotted place with deep water around it, but a pier down toward in the direction of Chicago. But a strong wind came up that afternoon, and we were playing ball, and a ball skipped out over my head, and I floundered to it, just learning how to swim. And another boy, whom I didn't know and my friends didn't know, went after the ball with me, but he never made it, and after a while I heard him crying for help. Well, without our realizing it, in a strong wind, we'd been swept up toward the Main Street Pier and toward deep water. And I kind of splashed over to him and held out my arm, the worst kind of technique for saving a life.
Now, how old were you, 12?
I was 12. And he grabbed my arm and got a panic hold around from behind on my neck. And then I tried to get out of that and just kept fighting to get air, but he would, his weight put me under the water. And I thought that I was going to drown. And I prayed, Lord, if you will save me, I will serve you. Well, one of my friends came up and hit him in the jaw, apparently, and knocked him off of me. And he was swept by a wave towards the old rotten pier, where he grabbed successfully hold of a piling. And I was swept out towards open water, opposite the end of the pier, and was so weak trying to touch and taking in more water that as I missed the end of the pier, I thought I'll try once more with the next wave. And as the wave came in, I was able to splash towards the last rotten piling that was protruding from the water. Meanwhile, my other friend had gone for help, and a man came and helped the boy in that we didn't know, and then came out and helped me by holding on to the pier. He supported me as we made our way to the beach. And I recall how grateful I was when I fell on my stomach prone on the beach, to think that I was out of that water. And for a long time at night, I didn't want to sleep on my back because that feeling of helplessness in the water came over me. But I date a determination to try to find the will of the Lord very much from that time. Although when we were still in St. Louis and before we moved to Evanston, I attended Sunday school.
Better cut.
I started it up again.
Can they?
I'm filming.
We want to take their books.
My book, I put my book over on the table, right here. This is my book. I don't know
What about Landon's book? Where's Landon's?
Where do Landon put his book? Where's this?
Little commotion here for the camera.
Well, you can stop it if you want.
Where's
No.
my playbook?
I don't know, sir.
I don't know.
Where
What did you do with it, Landon? We don't know. Here it is. Here it
There it
is.
is, Landon.
Come get it.
There's my playbook.
That was
Night,
great.
boys.
Great.
His train book.
Night-night.
Okay,
Ready?
where we were.
You retreat to your room. So in St. Louis, when I was about 10, I was attending a class in the Sunday school of the old Washington and Compton Avenues Presbyterian Church. And someone had put a map of the world on the wall, which had a quotation from Isaiah on the border, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? Here am I, send me." And I felt even then at 10 that God was calling me to be his servant or missionary or minister. So that unfolded many years later. Back to Evanston, my father was manager of the Chicago office of a New York financial firm, Goldman Sachs and Company. And while we were living in Evanston, he decided to buy a property down near Ivy, Virginia, some miles from Charlottesville, where he had had his boyhood and where he, at the University of Virginia, developed an undying loyalty to what he called the university. So while others were speculating wildly in the 1920s in the stock market, Dad made a wise purchase of about 100 acres there at Ivy.
Boy, I didn't realize it was that
And
big.
built a home there, which was first used for just summer and then later for year-round occupancy. In the beginning, we didn't have refrigerators in those days, so we were very dependent on the iceman to come and bring ice for our ice box. And for lights, we used kerosene oil lamps. And so I think we tended to go to bed earlier than otherwise.
Now, where did the name Pocahontas come from?
The name Pocahontas came from the Indian princess who was the daughter of Chief Powhatan, and who was part of the lore of Virginia, which my father loved. He claimed that the first families of Virginia had Pocahontas blood, and somewhere in the long process of descendants from Pocahontas and John Rolfe, we had some of her blood, supposedly.
In our family, in the Weisiger family.
Yes.
So he just named the estate Pocahontas
named the
out
place
of love for that.
Pocahontas out of his sentiment for early Virginia. My father was very sentimental about things, and he felt that when he crossed the state line, he felt better in Virginia, and he served once after he had retired from business as a secretary of the Alumni Association there at the university in Charlottesville. So we were back in the summer at least, where our family roots were in Virginia. My grandfather, Cary Sr., had had a farm between Ivy and Charlottesville. So that was a neighborhood where people could pronounce Weisiger naturally. They seemed to know the name somewhat.
Instead of saying Weisiger.
Our ancestor, Daniel Weisiger, had settled at about 1730 in the part of Virginia where Richmond came to be as a city. In due time, we had a family heirloom, an onyx representation of Pocahontas called a cameo, and that passed on to me, and then I gave it to the Jamestown Foundation, and it's on display now in the New World Pavilion down in Jamestown near the river.
I never knew that. I never saw
Yes.
it, I don't think.
Some miles from Williamsburg, where the Rockefellers did their restoration. So we were living in Evanston, and I went through Evanston High School, finishing in 1926.
At what age then
When I
did you
was 16,
finish high school?
and my parents thought I needed a postgraduate year, so they sent me to Stony Brook School, Long Island. And there at Stony Brook, I encountered a truly Christian faculty and a man, Dr. Frank Gabeline, who was the headmaster, who became a lifelong friend and a much admired model for me as a Christian scholar and gentleman. He was not a minister, but he was a man of letters. He was a distinguished man on the piano, and he loved mountain climbing as a hobby. So I had a year at Stony Brook where I was able to mature somewhat physically and able better to compete athletically. So I played end and part-time center on the football team, and then in the spring I ran on the track team. Stony Brook was a lovely year for me, a maturing year, so when I entered Princeton in the fall of 1927,
At age 17?
at age 17,
So just 1 year younger.
I was more adapted to socialize and to be active on the campus. I went to Princeton with a very strong intention of trying to be a Christian on the campus, though I knew in the late 20s that that wasn't a very popular thing to do. And I also tried to get into rounded activities like athletics, and I got my numerals in swimming and in track, and then later just specialized in track, running the quarter mile and the 220-yard low hurdles, which was an event of that time. I also went out for the press club so that I earned money during my sophomore, junior, and senior years in corresponding for metropolitan newspapers in Philadelphia and New York and Newark. And some of our members corresponded with papers in Boston or down in Baltimore and Washington. But the Eastern papers were glad to have undergraduates who would be stringers, that is, reporters just retained on the basis of paying them for a column inch of material that they would wire to those papers.
So you did it on a regular basis?
Yes,
though.
I became the correspondent by the time of my senior year for the New York American and the Philadelphia Inquirer. So at Princeton I chose to major in economics. I don't know now why I did that. It would have been more useful for me as a minister to have majored in English or history or philosophy. But at any rate, I majored in economics and did fairly well in that. It was in my senior year at Princeton that I had a letter from a famous agricultural missionary in India, Dr. Sam Higginbottom, and he invited me to go out to teach at the Allahabad Agricultural Institute, the equivalent of one of our junior colleges. And 4 days after graduation
So were
from
you
Princeton
20
University,
or 21?
I sailed at the age of 21 for India under appointment of the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions. I had almost 3 years in India, very wonderful, life-shaping years, during which I traveled around North India, saw the greatest mountains of the world up there in the Himalayas, and I was there to teach Bible, economics, and English, and also to coach athletics. Unexpectedly, I had to take charge of the Naini Leper Home, which had 600 patients and 150 segregated children. Dr. Higginbottom went on furlough, supposedly for 3 months, and he stayed away for 1 year and 8 months, so that I had quite an induction into the world of suffering. I had wonderful experiences with people in the leprosarium. Many of them became Christians, and that was and is a lasting element in my development as a minister. So after 3 years in India, I went overland through Baluchistan and Iran and Iraq and Syria and Palestine home in 1934.
Talk about on that train and
Oh,
with the Urdu
I stayed
speaking.
in the YMCA in Baghdad, and I had a day or two that I could use to go down to see the ruins of ancient Babylon at the modern town of Hillah, Hillah. And when I went down to the station after seeing the walls, the crumbling walls of old Babylon, I got into a train that was headed north for Baghdad. I found that it was loaded with Muslim pilgrims from India, of all places, so that I could speak some Hindustani with people on the train. When I first entered the compartment, a young man spoke to me in very impolite Hindustani, saying, "Piche jao," which means go out, scram. He probably thought that I, as a Westerner in Baghdad, would not know his language. But of course I did, and I replied in a very flowery way, asking them to allow me to sit by them. He was exceedingly embarrassed, but other men in the compartment made way for me, and we had a spirited conversation, partly in English and partly in Hindustani. And I found that some of these Muslims had been touched by one of our Presbyterian missionaries up in their part of India. So I made my way home and then began 3 years at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. We were staying in a hotel there, and it wasn't an altogether happy time because there was a great controversy raging in the Presbyterian Church between modernism and fundamentalism. And because our outstanding scholar and leader, Dr. Machen, was regarded as a fundamentalist, those of us who were at seminary were looked upon with suspicion by some of the bureaucrats of the Presbyterian Church. And when I graduated, a split had developed in the denomination. Dr. Machen had been disciplined by the General Assembly of 1936 at Syracuse for starting an independent board for Presbyterian foreign missions. And although I did not agree with his starting a rival mission board, I felt that he was given a raw deal by the denomination when he was expelled at that General Assembly of 1936. So I was turned down by the Philadelphia Presbytery to be taken under care, looking towards the ministry. And I was ordained by a splinter group, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, in May of 1937. My first pastorate, for which I got married, having wooed and won Elizabeth Whitney Forbes of Ridgewood, New Jersey, was a place where we had only 56 members.
Now, when did you meet Mom during this, and how long before?
I had met Betty at a student conference at the 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia about a year and a half before we had thoughts of getting married, and in 1937.
And this was on a blind date, right?
It was on a blind date arranged by her best friend from Vassar, Marguerite Dennison, and by my friend Luther Fink, who was 2 years ahead of me at Westminster Seminary. So in due time, we were married after I was called to be pastor of the Calvary Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. We met first on a second floor over a storefront opposite a beautiful gray stone Gothic church building of the First Presbyterian Church of Germantown, but we were a splinter group and not very popular. Then we met in the basement of a YWCA in Germantown, so that my first pastorate was in a time of controversy and of unusually deprived circumstances. We didn't have a building of our own, and we didn't have much identity. But after about 3 years, I was called to a church near our place in Virginia, the Olivet Presbyterian Church in the countryside of Albemarle County. And I felt very inclined to get away from the controversy in Philadelphia. And so in that situation, I became a member of the Presbyterian Church U.S., popularly called the Southern Presbyterian Church.
Now, was Cary born in?
Our first child, Cary,
Philadelphia.
was born in Germantown, Pennsylvania, in 1938. And then when we moved to Virginia, our second child, Mary, was born in the University Hospital in Charlottesville. Betty and I lived there in the country for almost 3 years, and we were very happy with those dear people in Albemarle County, Virginia. But the war broke out December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and I began to feel restless. I offered twice to go as a chaplain, but was turned down because we were over our quota of Southern Presbyterian ministers. But then a church in the Deep South, an old First Church of Augusta, Georgia, expressed an interest in me, and in due time I was called there, and I accepted the call in the fall of 1942, feeling that I would have a ministry to the soldiers out at Camp Gordon, and that proved to be the case. During my 6 years in Augusta, I sometimes did street preaching Saturday night where the buses came in from Camp Gordon. We were trying to reach some of the soldiers, and of course a number of them would worship with us, and we had various activities for them.
And
So
then John was born in Georgia.
John was born, our third child, in Augusta.
In what year?
In 19. Well, let's see, what was John's birth year?
November of.
He was born in November of.
Mary was 41, so.
So John was 43.
43, wasn't he 44 maybe, or 44?
No, 43,
Was he that
1943, I think.
Okay.
It was there in Augusta that I had a chance in a church of 600 members to learn to do the three essentials of normal pastorates: to preach and teach, to call on the people as a pastor, and to be an administrator, developing a program. We established new chapels around on the edge of the city and tried to get going again in a church that had run down from once being a great church in the Southern denomination. It was during my time in Augusta that one hot summer day I drove up to the Presbyterian Conference ground at Montreat, North Carolina, outside of Asheville. And while there, I talked with Dr. L. Nelson Bell, a well-known missionary, who was by that time retired and practicing medicine in Asheville. And he said, "I want you to meet my son-in-law." So I met a tall, blonde young man with piercing features by the name of Billy Graham. And when he talked to me about the amazing results he'd had preaching under the auspices of Youth for Christ in England and Scotland, I said, "Why don't you come down to Augusta and preach for a week in my church? I'll go down and ask my elders to invite you." Well, as it turned out, his people in Chicago were after him to do citywide meetings, and so I went around to the ministers of Augusta and was able to get enough support so that in the fall of 1948 we had Billy Graham for a citywide meeting in the municipal auditorium in what was his first invitation by ministers to hold a public meeting.
Was he not well known at that time?
No,
then?
no, he was a young man of 28 or of 27, whatever. So that was his first evangelistic meeting where ministers invited him to a city. And later on he became well known, especially after he held a meeting in Los Angeles. And William Randolph Hearst gave him great publicity in his Los Angeles paper. And of course, since then, and during all the years, Billy Graham has stood out as an outstanding proclaimer of the gospel in many lands, not only mainly in our country. So in the fall of 1948, my family and I moved to Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania, where our fourth child, Ruthie, was born. And she was born in 1951.
51.
She was the caboose on our family train and came along 8 years after John and more years after Mary and Cary. So there I had an opportunity in a great church. At that time, the Mount Lebanon United Presbyterian Church was the largest in the old United Presbyterian denomination. And we grew from about 2,500 to 3,000 members in our listing. And it really was a wonderful church where I had an opportunity to stretch myself with more than I had to give as a minister, whether in preaching and teaching or in pastoring or in administering. But it was a great experience to be there for almost 13 years. And during that time, in 1 year, I made a round-the-world trip to look at mission work in Africa and Asia. What sparked that was that one of our members had been ill and I'd called on her. Her husband had died and her son had been killed during World War II and she had no close relatives. And I ministered to her in line of duty, and when she died I found that she had left me enough money for a world trip. So I went to the session of the church and said...
With that in mind, did she specify what it was to go for? Just left the cash?
No, it was just she made a bequest.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought since I got it in line of duty, it would be appropriate to use it for church work. So I went to the elders and got permission to be gone for 6 weeks on a trip around the world. And I got a young man in the church who was a professor of engineering at the University of Pittsburgh, Alfred C. Ockenheil, Jr., to go with me. And so in due time, about a year after the lady had died, Mrs. Weir, we left for India and flew.
Now, what year was this?
That was in 1953 and 54, I believe, the winter of 1953 and 54. We began in Egypt and saw our work there, then went down to the Sudan, saw the work in some of those primitive towns where the men went naked all the time, and we flew over to the edge of Ethiopia, where there was a remarkable work under a man named, my memory.
Your memory is great. Boy, these names and dates are amazing.
I'll take it.
Well, relatively. They'll get up and down and talk. You'll have to tell them several times that they're to be quiet, and they'll get up and go to the bathroom and mess around, but they're tired. So you don't have to be real severe with them, but you may have to remind them to tone it down.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're rolling here again. So you remember that name where you left off?
The name of the missionary was Don McClure, and many years later he was martyred. A guerrilla band over in Ethiopia killed him when they were making a raid on a mission station. So then we went from Ethiopia back up to Egypt and flew across through Basra and to Pakistan and India. And of course it was an outstanding experience for me to be back some 20 years after I had left India, and to see old friends when I went through Allahabad, and to see work that I had known so well 2 decades before. When I revisited the Naini Leper home, some old lepers said, "You used to make us go to church on Sunday." So I was that way before I became a pastor. At any rate, from India, my friend and I, Allahabad, flew from Calcutta to Bangkok, Thailand, and then on to Hong Kong. And from Hong Kong, he went independently to the Philippines, and I went to Japan, where I saw a missionary couple at Osaka who had volunteered for the foreign field under my ministry in Augusta, Georgia. And it was very gratifying to see Dr. and Mrs. Ovid Bush, who founded what is now known as the Yodogawa Hospital in Osaka, Japan, a large hospital in a very poor section of a city, ministering in Christ's name to the needy of that area. And so I flew home with my friend who joined me in Japan to Anchorage, Alaska, and then to Seattle, and then on to Pittsburgh. I regarded that mission trip of 6 weeks as a highlight of my time in Pittsburgh, and during that time I had received an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree from Muskingum College in 1950, and for 12.5 years I had the honor of being pastor of that church. Then, in the summer of 1961, we made the trek to California, where I was to be pastor of the Menlo Park Presbyterian Church in the Bay Area, next door to Stanford. That proved to be a difficult pastorate in the 1960s because of the unrest in the nation, where some young people never really recovered from the impact of student revolt over at Berkeley in 1964 under a man named Mario Savio, and then the civil rights disturbances and Black Panthers in the gray area, in the Bay Area, and then the Flower Children and Timothy Leary's influence up at Haight-Ashbury, free sex and free drugs, and then the war in Vietnam, which sparked very violent protests on the campuses of many colleges and universities. I recall that it was probably in the spring of 1970 that the Palo Alto Times came out with an editorial, "Can Stanford Save Itself?" because of the mindless breaking and burning that took place on the campus in protest against our involvement in Vietnam. It was not a war that I myself particularly endorsed. I thought maybe we had a 51% right to be there, but I was willing to help a student who was a conscientious objector to be spared from going to war against his conscience. So after that, the war was ended, we achieved a degree of calmness in the church. We had some turnovers in our staff, and we were all looking in the same direction of theological conviction and purpose, and the church began to be more normal in the early 70s. Actually, then I was nearing the end of my active ministry. And at the end of 1973, I resigned from the pulpit of the Menlo Park Church to go into honorary retirement. One bright spot in my final year there was that we gave more to world mission than we spent on the operation of the church. And it had always been my hope and prayer that I would have a church that would be able to give more to the world mission of Christ than to the local mission at the church. So we moved into retirement, and I had to feel that I was not worthy to be a minister, but God had given me the blessing of working down the line of eternity, as I used to think of it, in doing gospel work as a preacher and pastor and administrator.
Now, you stayed on in Menlo Park for a bit after you
We
retired?
stayed on in Menlo Park from the beginning of 1974 until May of 1977. And then we moved to be residents of
And you had bought that house that was originally the manse?
We had bought the manse in 1966.
And that was the first property you'd owned then?
Yes, we'd never thought we'd own a home, but Congress had passed a rule that ministers could take a tax avoidance for the down payment and subsequent mortgage payments on a house. And so by 1972, before we retired, I had paid for the house, and it was ours.
Completely?
Yes.
And now, when did you start
In
it?
6 years, in 1966.
In 6 years you paid for it? And what did you pay for that house?
$42,680. When we left in 1977, we sold it for $129,000. 3 years later, it sold for $258,000.
With a bit of a remodel.
And now there have been considerable improvements, and I'm told that it would easily go for well over $500,000.
Amazing. Little 3-bedroom rambler on
Yes.
a lot.
Not even a family room, but it's been enlarged by the people who own it now. People, incidentally, members of the Menlo Park Presbyterian Church. But
So then you moved.
before we moved, however, I began doing some teaching as an adjunct at San Francisco Seminary over at San Anselmo, and at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena. And I did some interim work in the Glendale Presbyterian Church and the Walnut Creek Presbyterian Church, and later in St. Andrews down at Newport Beach, and at the Fallbrook Presbyterian Church, and finally at the Burlingame Presbyterian Church in the Bay Area. But during those years, which were rather busy years,
Oh, a little aftershock. I wonder if that registered on the camera. That we just had a major earthquake here in Los Angeles 2 days ago on the 17th.
we just now felt a bump.
Yeah, what was the original, a 6.6?
It was a 6.6 shake up at Northridge, centered at Northridge, California, west and north of here in the San Fernando Valley. Could you feel that bump then?
Do you feel we just had
You were
aftershock?
walking.
I was walking, so
No.
no, I didn't.
Just
I'm
moments
missing
ago.
out on all of these.
So I said it on the camera. It would keep things in.
So anyway,
I really felt it.
Oh, good.
after we moved to Monte Vista Grove Homes in
You
1977,
might explain what Monte Vista is.
a place for retired Presbyterian ministers in Pasadena.
Where everyone now actually buys their own unit. It's like they're in duplex.
Well, they come in different ways as builder donors or rebuilder donors, or just as rehabilitating members that don't have much money. But I seem to have a lull in being invited to be an interim pastor in churches in 1980 when I was 70. And with Betty's acquiescence, I went to a friend at Fuller Seminary, Dr. Jack Rogers, and asked if Fuller would take me as a candidate for a PhD degree. So in the process of 4 years, I did my research work at the Huntington Library, whose Puritan treasures are said to be second only to those of the British Museum in London. And I worked on Puritan theology and received a PhD degree when I was 74. It's a little unusual, but it was a satisfying personal project for me. And I felt that my ministry, such as it might be in my retirement years, would be enriched by that study, and I think it has been. Well, I look back on this career, and I'm grateful that I had the encouragement of my father and mother and grandparents in the ministry. I believe that my grandmother, Betty Humphreys Weisiger, prayed me into the ministry. I have a boyhood recollection of her visiting our home in Evanston, and of her sitting on a couch with a Bible in her lap, and of her asking me to come over and explain a passage of Scripture to her. She was getting me to learn how to explain the Scriptures. She was a dear Christian, and I loved her very much. My father had been in the banking business from the beginning. My grandfather, Cary Sr., had been in the cotton business in Memphis after farming near Charlottesville, Virginia. He loved to tell me out of his memory of the colonel, as they called him. He never was served in an army, but they called him that. He would love to tell me stories of the war between the states. As a boy, he remembered when his father and family lived along the banks of the James River in Virginia during the war, and they lived on beans. That's all they had to eat for a while. And he loved to tell the story of Confederate bravery, the story of the Confederate soldier who had been captured and taken before General Ulysses S. Grant. And after Grant finished questioning the soldier said, "General, sir, I'd like to ask you a question, sir." And the general said, "Well, that's all right, go ahead." So he says, "Just what you aiming to do, General Grant?" He said, "Well, I'm going to press on south and take Richmond." "Then what you fixing to do?" "Well, I'm going to defeat Lee and his army." "Then what you fixing to do?" "Well, I guess I'll retire and then I'll go to heaven." "No, you won't," said the soldier. "Stonewall Jackson's up there, and he won't let you in." So my grandfather took great delight in that kind of thing. He was very definitely a Southern gentleman of the old breed. But he'd been a Presbyterian elder, as my father had been. And as I say, I had family encouragement to be a minister.
You're getting tired. Talk
Wanna take a
about
break?
Grandpa's, through the banking thing and the financial.
Well,
Things he
my
went
father had worked in the St. Louis Clearing House, an organization that handled checks from various banks as those checks got back to their original banks. And then he had been manager of the St. Louis office of this New York firm, Goldman Sachs and Company. And from there he became manager of the Chicago office of Goldman Sachs. But he was released in the Depression in the early 1930s, and then he served for 4 years managing the great Deering estate called Vizcaya in South Miami, and after that he served as a secretary of the Alumni Council of the University of Virginia when he and Mother were back in Virginia. Dad was a Virginian of the old school, and as I said earlier, claimed that he felt better whenever he crossed the state line and got back home in Virginia. And for him, Albemarle County was the dimple of the universe. And one time he said to me, "Son, remember, you can't beat Cavalier blood." Well, that was a reference to the early Jamestown settlement. And my answer was, "Well, Dad, Americans look back to the Pilgrims because the Cavaliers in Virginia brought class distinctions with them, and the Pilgrims and the Puritans didn't in the same way. Although it's true that the Puritan ministers felt that they, as an elite, should govern the colony of Massachusetts. So the human inconsistencies are always cropping up. But from my father and grandfather, I inherited a real love for the state of Virginia, which I couldn't claim as my native state because I was born in St. Louis. And I had not gone to the university at Charlottesville, but had strayed up to Princeton through the influence of an uncle. But nonetheless, to this day, I'm grateful for our family heritage, and it's a Christian heritage. Going back across the years to Virginia, we have found that when Daniel Weisiger, our ancestor, settled in what is now Richmond, that there's a record that he was active in starting a church there in Richmond. So it's been in the family line to do that.
Is that the Daniel Weisiger that Mary sent us that little ad, that he was the first to help commission the first public highway? And remember that
That
little
little blurb from the paper, wasn't it?
a little trivia thing that she cut out.
I
He
don't
and two other
remember
men
that.
got together and somehow put together the first public highway in this country.
There was a relative of ours, or an ancestor, I don't know which, who was prominent in the early years of Kentucky and lived at Frankfort and enjoyed a good reputation there.
That's where it was. It was in Kentucky. Yeah.
In Frankfort, maybe.
And it wasn't Daniel Weisiger, but there must have been several over the
be.
years.
I forget what his name was.
What about Grandma?
My grandmother, or my mother, you mean?
Yeah.
My mother had been born in New York City in 1884. My father was born in 1882 in Memphis, Tennessee. But Mother was born in New York City, and then the family moved to St. Louis. And she grew up there, attending the Mary Institute, as it was called, a school for girls in St. Louis. And she went to some function at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, where she met Dad. And so in due time, Dad followed her to St. Louis, and they were married there in the on the family estate on my mother's side, out in St. Louis County, at a place called Alden Hall, A-L-D-E-N, a family name going back to the early New England times.
Remember what year that was?
I think they were married in 1905, I think. So after that time, there was a panic in things financial, and my father was working for his father-in-law, William C. Little, and they went through hard times, and this proved to be a spiritual blessing to my father and mother. They had been nominal Episcopalians, but going through that hard time made them cast themselves more on the Lord in a genuine Christian faith. And they became, both of them became very interested in reading the Bible. And as long as they lived, one of their major interests, if not the commanding interest of their lives, was the world mission of Christ. And so, of course, when I came along and then told them my senior year at Princeton that I'd been asked to be a short-term missionary, they were entirely supportive, and were always glad that I was in a church calling. Dad lived to be 83, excuse me, 83. He died in 1965.
He was a heavy smoker.
Yeah, he'd been a very heavy smoker, and in the latter years of his life he'd had operations on one lung and on his throat and his mouth because of nicotine abuse.
I remember him when he gave up smoking though and started eating those hardball candies.
Yes.
And whenever we'd go to visit him, I can just picture him in that study there, and he'd look down over his nose, over his glasses, and
Right.
bring out the candies and ask you if you wanted a sour ball. And I
Right.
thought he was a terrifying man to me when I was young.
Well, he was very.
And then he'd send us immediately upstairs to find a silver dollar on his
Yes.
bureau that
He
he'd
was
have
a
for
very
us.
loving grandfather, actually. And Dad was a feeling man. More than being a thinker, he was a doer to some extent, but especially he was a feeler, strong feeler. He felt that the country was going in a bad direction under Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he became very exercised about that. And during some of those years when Roosevelt was in office, they could hardly, my father and grandfather, who would be visiting us in Virginia, could hardly wait for the morning news so that they could exchange exclamations about how it was satanic or diabolical what the president was doing in Washington.
Sounds like my family.
Yeah.
Yes. Dad lived to be 83, and dear Mom lived to be 103. And until the last week of her life, when she was so frail and physically depleted, she didn't respond in conversation. But up until that time, her brain had been remarkably clear, and her memory of current events was outstanding. She could ask about the family or about some aspect of world mission, and she could remember it, even after she was 100 years of age.
Until that last time in the nursing home, she lived at home with her
She lived
daughter.
with my sister Margaret a good deal until the last 2 years. She was in and out of several nursing.
But wasn't Aunt Margaret about 80 at the time?
Yes.
And she had her mother living at home with her, caring
And
for her mother.
Finally, she agreed to my urging and that of my brother Carter and sister May to have help in the home, nursing help, because we felt she was breaking down under the load of night and day care of Mom, who was nearing the end. But toward the end, Mother had to be, she was in at least 2 different nursing homes there in Arlington, Virginia, where she'd gone to make her home after Dad died and after she gave up the property, sold the property in Ivy. So I'm very grateful. My father used to pray about the children and the grandchildren being in the covenant, the Lord's covenant of grace, and pray that they would be sealed under the blood. That was his language for the cross. And of course we have the hope of a great reunion on the other side.
Take a break.